I really hadn't admitted that I had done anything wrong.
The point being, it was a far more significant experience for you than it was for them.
So I know you, I understand you, I can understand what you've done.
And I am you. I am you.
This program is the fifth in a series of 12 candid conversations between George Mann and Dick Rice. They've walked the 12 steps of AA, gained new insights, and deepened their spirituality in the process. They've come together to share more of their personal stories and growth experiences. Dr. George Mann is Medical Director of St. Mary's Chemical Dependency Services in Minneapolis. Father Dick Rice is the Director of Loyola Spiritual Direction Center in St. Paul, Minnesota.
As we deepen our understanding of ourselves and God and begin to take more responsibility for who and what we are, we're ready for the fifth step, which says, we admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs.
To complement that step, George, I could have easily chosen any of the 7 penitential psalms, but I thought I would stay with the one that is probably most familiar to us, the 51st Psalm. Have mercy on me, O God, in your goodness. In the greatness of your compassion, wipe out my offense. For I acknowledge my offense. My sin is before me always.
One of the most wonderful experiences of my life is to see people coming out of the fifth step. And you see the peace and the joy and the relaxation and the euphoria of the experience of coming to another human being and coming to God through that human being, of saying, here I am, this is all of me, take a look, and what do you think? And the experience is that you are a wonderfully good, basic personality. You are of God. You have that. You have those qualities, and the realization in the heart of that person who maybe has never realized that before.
Even though I've made a number of mistakes and maybe done a number of things wrong. That certainly was my experience. I made a fifth step, or began my first fifth step, as part of a fourth and fifth step workshop, and sat down in the afternoon of this workshop to list some of my wrongs, and then to just begin to take a fifth step, because the counselor realized a number of us were just terrified, really at the fear of being abandoned on the basis of what we had done. He had us mention in the course of the afternoon, to get our feet wet in a fifth step, one wrong that we had done. Well, my turn came. We were free to participate or not, and I said, well, I'm just like everybody else. I've done some things wrong. And the room was silent. Finally, the counselor said, name one. Well, I chose propensity quite obvious to anyone who would know me longer than 10 minutes, and I said, well, I'm frequently late, and thought that would be enough. And he said, name once when you've been late. Whew. I took a deep breath. And I can still remember what I said. I said I kept a couple of young Jesuit seminarians waiting for a half an hour outside the doors of the Little Sisters of the Poor home in St. Paul. A half an hour after I had told them that I would be there, I finally came to pick them up. I think I thought at that moment the whole world was going to end. But what I realized in that, particularly by the acceptance the counselor and the other people who were working the step with me was that until I had admitted it in public, until I had said it in time and space, I really hadn't admitted that I had done anything wrong. And the wisdom of the Swiss psychiatrist, Paul Tournier, really came true. I had read years before how he had said, as regard a fifth step, regarding also the sacrament of reconciliation in the Catholic community, he had said, until a person admits the exact nature of having done something wrong, you haven't really admitted it. So the word admit is a key word to this step, not only the first word, but I found key to a time and space acknowledgement that I had really done wrong. Once I could say it, then I was into the step.
I'm curious, how long ago had you kept those Jesuit seminarians waiting?
It had been about 6 months before that.
6 months before, a fair length of time. My suspicion is that if you would have asked the seminarians at the same time, do you remember when Dick Rice kept you waiting for 30 minutes? They would have said, well, gee, I don't know if I really remember that. Oh, yes, I think I do. The point being, it was a far more significant experience for you than it was for them. And I think that's one of the big issues in the fifth step is the differentiation between shame and guilt. You were ashamed of yourself, and you had the process of shame was something that you had done to you. Guilt is always an external process. Shame is an internal process. We shame ourselves, and shame very frequently is way out of proportion to the act itself. I can take something that's fairly insignificant and be very ashamed of it. I think people who are dealing with the problem of troubled consciousness or scrupulosity, I think that's really what they do is the issues of shame and guilt get all twisted around in their mind. And one of the real advantages or one of the real functions of the fifth step is to somehow be able to separate those two.
I had covered myself, my own sense of shame at myself, with a perfectionism. As long as I did everything perfectly, then no one would notice that underneath I felt very badly about myself and looked upon myself as a bad person. Well, once I had to admit that I had done some bad things, then that whole sense of perfectionism crumbled too, because I couldn't any longer say I was doing it perfectly or had any hope to do it perfectly. When you're working with someone right here and now, someone who might come into your life or into your office, how do you cut through that to help them differentiate? Do you have any good questions or any graced ways of working with people that help them differentiate, questions that you ask them or anything?
I think there are a lot of ways to do it. And I think one of the real factors is what we have talked about repeatedly is the whole issue of self-image. And that is that shame, perfectionism, the things that you have talked about, have their home in poor self-image. The worse my self-image is, the more likely I am to shame myself for actions that may be totally neutral or maybe slightly bad, exaggerating things, needing to be perfect in all the things that I do, and really being terribly hard on myself when I deviate from that a little bit. The person who, is the opposite of Dick Rice, who's very prompt and who prides themselves on their promptness and works very hard to attain that, is very perfectionistic about it. If that person is 5 minutes late, it becomes a serious issue for that person. Whereas if that person really has some balance, is in touch with reality, has a good self-image, have all the things that you and I have spoken of, being late for 5 minutes is looked at realistically, say, well, it's no big deal. It's no big problem. I misjudged it by a couple of minutes. It's really no problem. So I think that you can gloss over it, but I think that all of these things really kind of lead back to the same kinds of basic issues of who am I, how do I behave, how does that behavior fit with my basic nature, what are my positives, what are my negatives, how do I relate to God, how do I relate to other people, and trying to put all of those pieces together, and then out of that comes the metamorphosis that the steps entail of coming out to be a whole new person.
And I find just taking the step constructs that person. That in taking the fifth step, what I realized was I am a good person. I'm a God-given, graced, blessed person. And I can do some very good things, and I have, and I can do some very bad things, and some very wrong things, and I have. But that is so different than the shame-based person who says, I'm basically bad. From beginning to end, I'm basically bad, and I might fool people by doing some good things. But if they ever got close. And I actually cut through a lot of the shame by taking the fifth step. I found questions that were very helpful for me in taking the step were, what do I really accuse myself of? The exact nature of the wrongs, and as you've implied, the ramification of the wrongs. That those young Jesuits can't even remember the event, or 5 minutes late is not particularly horrendous. So exact nature is very important, not only the wrong itself, but all the ramifications of it. So of what do I accuse myself? What was my intent, really? Which usually was a very good intent. Always was, because I never see wrong at the time. I wouldn't do wrong. It's only on hindsight that I see how wrong it was. Short-sighted, selfish, unconcerned about others. And then knowing what I do now, have I learned from the wrong at all? Would I do it? Those three, would I do it now with the knowledge that I have? Those three questions I find very helpful in preparing myself and then taking the step with another.
And they do quite clearly differentiate shame and guilt.
The questions themselves do.
The questions themselves do, if you're looking at a specific issue. One of the other things that you referred to earlier in our conversation that I think we need to have some discussion about is how does the fifth step differ from the Roman Catholic sacrament of confession or penance?
What has been your experience, both as one taking and receiving the fifth step?
One of my experiences is lots of confusion. I think lots of confusion for people who are Catholic, who really look at the fifth step in a lot of ways as a form of penance, a form of confession. I think for people who are not Catholic, they're even more confused because they know some things, or they may know some things about the sacrament of penance, and they wonder if this is the same thing. I think that it's the issue here is one of culpability. In the Catholic sense of confession, when I go into the confessional, I am saying mea culpa, mea culpa. I am culpable. These are things that I recognize that I have done that have offended God, and I am there to confess them and to receive forgiveness for those culpable acts and to be reconciled to God. Okay. The fifth step does not talk about culpability. The fifth step says, I have done this inventory. I am prepared to talk about myself. And I talk about myself in a very open, public way, in the sense that I'm talking to another human being, and I'm including God in it. And I'm saying, here I am. Here is me. I don't ask, as a part of the fifth step, asking forgiveness is not a part of the fifth step.
No, that I agree.
It is simply a self-revelation. I'm revealing myself as well as I know myself to you and to God.
Now you better help me here, George, because in both the Catholic sacrament of reconciliation and my understanding of the fifth step, I am admitting I have done wrong.
Right.
I am taking responsibility for this action as having been mine. I'm not blaming anybody else. I'm not trying to dismiss it. So, to my understanding of culpability, I'm certainly taking full responsibility for a wrong as a wrong.
But I'm not asking for forgiveness. I am not saying, forgive me for these wrongs. And I think that talks about another, another point in that is that I think the process of a fifth step also has to include some of the positives. Maybe going back to your fifth step, if I had been hearing your fifth step and was asked, to give me an example of when you were late, I might follow that and say, now give me an example of the last time you were on time. Let's take a look at your virtues. Let's take a look at that other side, because as we said when we were discussing the fourth step, it's always easier for a lot of reasons for us to talk about our sins, our wrongs, our negatives. Much harder for me to talk about the positive things. I mean, that's bragging. There's a sense about the need to be humble, the need to not stand up and say, here I am, and here's the wonderful, good person that I am. And so the fifth step is a blend of those things, whereas the sacrament of penance, we don't talk about those kinds of things.
Yes, that certainly is a difference as well. And I agree that I am not coming in a fifth step to a member of the community to ask for the forgiveness of God mediated through the community. At the same time, the choice of who I'm going to reveal myself to is a key and often a very difficult choice for people, and I think a lot of people will resist the fifth step because they haven't yet found a likely candidate to receive it, which often enough is a rationalization and a postponement forever of the step. But I found in taking it myself that I did very carefully choose someone who I had every reason to believe would accept me. I wasn't coming asking for the forgiveness of God mediated in the community, but I knew that I could only admit in the presence of someone who had some history with me, was skilled and trained, would not look askance. I was even afraid in preparing myself for it that this person might gag or throw up or say, you really are the worst person I've ever met.
I think one of the marvelous historical things about these steps that is so wonderful, and this is sort of an imaginary scenario of the steps coming out of the early roots of AA. In the early roots of AA, there were not trained people. There were not people who had any special background in fifth step work at all. It was simply a person who had been there, who had experienced it, who had struggled with everything that this other person is struggling with, and the person who was brand new into the AA program and was working through their own life, to sit down with another person who just an ordinary person without any kind of background and say, well, here I am, and the other person with great ease could say, yeah, I understand, I've been there.
Mm. So I know you, I understand you, I can understand what you've done, I still love you.
And I am you. I am you.
When I've had that experience of being accepted like that in the fifth step, I've been surprised at the movement I make from admission to further acceptance. They're not exactly the same thing within me, or I find within a lot of people. I can come into a fifth step and begin admitting. And once I find I'm accepted by the other receiving me, well, I can accept these wrongs and often enough rights about myself much more fully than I did even a half an hour earlier when I was beginning to admit them.
One of the dynamics I've experienced repeatedly over the years is that if you have an individual who is a Catholic, who has gone to confession repeatedly, hundreds of times maybe during their lifetime, and makes a fifth step for the first time, they talk about the vast difference inside of them, how they feel, and kind of the typical response is that, well, when I go to confession, I come out of confession, and I really don't feel that much different. I know something has happened, but I don't feel that much different. The feeling of people coming out of a fifth step is very, very different. And I think what happens in the process, and you kind of identified it and spoke of it, is that there is this great expansion of self-acceptance and acceptance that occurs during the process of the fifth step, and coming to a level of self-acceptance that that person has probably never ever achieved before. And out of that self-acceptance come all this rush of positive, wonderful, good feelings about who I am and what I am.
So often enough, an experience, finally, and a realization of forgiveness given through the fifth step that if only it had been there in a number of our celebrations of confession.
I had a marvelous experience at one time as I was processing through all of my own feet of clay and behaviors, destructive, good, bad, sins, all of those kind of things. I went to a concert one night, and there were perhaps 2,000 people at the concert. For the first time in my life, I sat in that group of 2,000 people, and I knew that everyone in that concert hall was exactly like me. Even though obviously there were many differences, external differences that you could enumerate, you could have a whole list of them. When I worked through those external accidental differences and got to the core, got to the essence, I knew that I could identify with every person in that concert hall. It was a feeling like I had never experienced before.
Very similar, I find, in celebrating the sacrament of reconciliation. I have become a much more accepting, loving, I think, forgiving individual. I've become a better instrument of mediating the forgiveness of God by taking and receiving the fifth step than by any other kind of preparation for that, the celebration of that sacrament.
As we work through the process of these steps, there are two things that occur simultaneously and that are so closely intertwined that we almost consciously can't separate them. And that is that I come to a fuller understanding of who and what I am. And at the same time, I come to the recognition that the differences that I perceive between myself and others are what separate me. The similarities are what join me. And as that process occurs, the list of similarities increases and increases and increases. So the differences, the distances, the fear of intimacy, the sense of separation, all of that begins to change. And I recognize what you are, I am. What you can do, I can do. What feet of clay you have, I have. And it doesn't make any difference of who and what you are. And I think as a part of that whole process, then is this growing, deepening relationship with God.
I think so too. And one of my concerns, though, is what you've said is so much a fruit of the first 5 steps. And I think a lot of people stop right there. We've got miles to go before we sleep, and we've got further steps to take if we're really going to grow together.
Right.
The steps that really help us keep growing are the ones that come up now. So I'm eager to take step 6 with you and to walk on. Thank you for this walk, my brother. Thank you.